Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Chaos on the Bridge, the 2020 documentary that focuses on the chaos behind the scenes of Star Trek Next Generation in its first 3 seasons. This was a Patreon requested video requested by patron Greg Marley. And I will just read what Greg Marley stated about how he felt about the movie. He said, it wasn't perfect. In fact, I was as frustrated by it as I felt rewarded. For instance, you could tell that the fast, fun, breezy pace it decided to take meant that tons of interview footage with various important people was left out, which is incredibly frustrating. Still, it really is an important document on the history of TOS and TNG by a lot of the main participants. So, I pretty much agree with that assessment of the film. I was thinking the same thing when I was just watching it recently, that you could tell there's a lot more. Like, it would have been interesting to see like extra footage. Maybe if you buy like the Blu-ray or something, it might have had like extra interview footage, which would have been really interesting. I think you get the impression that they had to focus, they had to cut out a lot to focus on the main story. I personally also found that I don't think the narrative was focused. I think they kind of went all over the place, and I think the ending where it ends with Shatner saying, talking about how TNG was nominated for an Emmy. It was the first only syndicated show to be nominated for, best TV show, best drama series, I think they called. And he's like, oh, pretty impressive, or something that's crazy doodle, or whatever the hell Maurice Hurley called it, wackadoodle, or whatever. Not so this is what William Shatner said. He said, not so wackadoodle after all. And he turns around and walks away, and then they end the movie. I didn't find that I felt to me like they didn't know how to end the movie, so that's the best they could come up with. I don't know, because it doesn't really have a narrative. Like, even documentaries, and it reminded me of the time that I made my, film school documentary, and it's a difficult thing, and I don't actually like documentaries very much. I used to like them. But when I went to film school and learned about how they were made and participated in making one, it made me see like just how crafted they are, and even though it's technically nonfiction, it's really, you try to find a story within interviews and real life situations, and so you try to craft a narrative, and I was like, I just prefer writing a story. And I don't know, I just find it is kind of just like I don't like reality shows, but because it's kind of a cheat. But then, if there's a documentary on, a subject I'm really interested in and want to learn more about, like, for example, Star Trek, then yeah, sure, I'll definitely watch it. But yeah, so I watched this when, I don't want to say when it first came out. I don't think it was 2020. I think it actually came out before then. No, it definitely came out before then, because it came out before Discovery was a thing. So it must have been like 2015 or something like that. Hold on, let me look this up. Chaos on the Bridge, 2014. Okay, wow. So that's 11 years old. Yeah, so I didn't see it in 2014. It was something more like 2017 or 2018 when I first saw it. But I watched it again fairly recently when I was doing my coverage of Season 1 and 2 of TNG's. I think specifically I watched it in preparation for the video I did for my commentary on the writing of season 3 of TNG, because they talked about the writing of season 3 a bit in that movie, and so I did this whole video, and I touched on the first 2 seasons and Maurice Hurley and all that. And I also I read this book that has all these interviews from all the writers and stuff, and I've watched a lot of other interviews, and so sometimes I had to jumble in my head exactly which interviews were in the documentary or which ones I saw elsewhere or read from the book. So I feel like I have talked on my channel a lot about what the documentary reveals. I did use that a lot in my coverage of the first 3 seasons of TNG, and in that video about the commentary of the writing of season 3 of TNG, even though the movie's more about seasons 1 and 2 than it is about season 3. In fact, I feel like the bulk of the movie is about the creation of Next Generation and season 1, and then they kind of breeze through season 2 kind of quickly, and they breeze through season 3 kind of quickly. And also, they have Brenna Braga as one of the people they interviewed, and they show clips from his interviews throughout. Yet he didn't join the show until season 4. And the movie doesn't even cover season 4. I mean, it covers season 3 pretty quickly, but then they quickly breeze through what happens for the rest of the show, important things like Roddenberry's death, which actually happened during the filming of season 5, it winning an Oscar, or not an Oscar, Emmy, being nominated, didn't win. I just watched the episode that was based off that, with Bashir being nominated for this medical award, not winning. But no, and then being nominated for Emmy, and the fact that the ratings were so high and it became a colossal, success and spawned movies and stuff like that. But really, it really only went up to season 3, and yet they had Brenna Braga. But he was commenting on the show as a whole, or maybe commenting on what he thought of the first couple seasons, or of Roddenberry specifically. And same with Ronald D. Moore. He did join the staff in season 3, but they had a lot of his commentary on the earlier seasons as well. And one thing in particular that he said was that the first 2 seasons are nearly unwatchable, which I think is a little bit harsh, but it's funny that he says that now, because, well, you could say that he's biased because those are the only 2 seasons that he wasn't on staff for, so that's kind of biased. But also, I mean, there's no denying that the first 2 seasons were worse. That's what everyone says. But he liked the show. He liked the show well enough to take a tour, which was during season 2. It was during the episode Times Squared. Didn't mention that in this movie, but I know that from other sources. So they didn't seem. They interviewed David Gerrold and DC Fontana, who were there for the first part of the first season. David Gerrold, actually, who wrote some of my favorite TOS episodes, like Cloud Miners, he was basically the one who created the characters, who crafted the Bible that the show was based off of. And DC Fontana wrote, Encounter Farpoint, and Gene Roddenberry came in behind her and added in Q, which pissed her off. So they were definitely responsible for a lot of the groundwork of it. But yeah, I interviewed them. I interviewed Maurice Hurley, of course, and Tracy Torme, which I hear a lot about him, but he didn't seem to actually write that many episodes. I hear, this is one thing I think the documentary. So if I'm going to be critical of the documentary, the thing I'll say is that I don't think it had focus. And I understand how they want to talk about the cast and the actors. And they talked about Patrick Stewart, and they told the story about how he walked off the set when Entertainment Tonight was filming, and he got pissed off and went home, and they had to call him back and that sort of thing. And they had some other interviews with Jonathan Frakes and stuff, and talking about Denise Crosby and the fight she had leaving the show. And but here's the thing. I feel like, as much as interesting as I think that stuff is, I think it loses focus. I think if you're going to focus on how chaotic, because that's what the movie's called, Chaos on the Bridge, it's supposed to be a focus on how chaotic the writer's room is, that you should focus on that. Focus on the writers, focus on the producers. Don't go off in these side tangents about the cast. I mean, everyone, of course, wants to hear about the cast, but that's a different movie. That's not the movie you're making. And it's like something, for example, like Gates McFadden getting fired. That's related because that was Maurice Hurley who didn't like her and thought she didn't work for the show. So that was relevant. So if you want to interview her about that, fine, because it's about the writing, but it should remain focused on the writing. And this is when they interviewed Diane Muldaur, or Muldaur, however you say her name, Pulaski, and she was saying that she didn't work out for her, and they asked her to leave, and she was okay with that because she didn't really like it either, and she never fit in. It's funny because the funny thing is that she said that in talking to William Shatner, she was like, oh, when we were doing Star Trek, because she was in a couple episodes of the original series, she was like, it was all about, the characters and the character actings, but Next Generation was just a weird technical sci-fi show that happened to have characters in it. Because it's a funny thing that she said that, because that's exactly what Michael Piller said and what he changed. In fact, they had an interview because it did cover the season 3. As I said, the portion of the movie that covered season 3, it had an interview with Ronald D. Moore. I do think, unfortunately, this movie was made after Michael Piller's passing. I believe that was sometime in the early 2000s, if I remember. Maybe it's 2009 or something like that. But it might have even been earlier than that. I can't remember. But so it was made after his passing, so they couldn't interview him. But they had Ronald D. Moore, who was talking about how Michael Piller made it all about, specific characters. Like, this is either going to be a Worf episode or a Picard episode. Dax is the wrong show, but Worf or Crusher or Troy episode. And how Michael Piller, his major change was to change the fact that the show wasn't about the characters and to make it about the characters. And I talked about this in my commentary for season 3, and I mention it all the time on how much I love Michael Piller and how I do think he saved Star Trek because he made it about the characters. And he had his hand in creating DS9, who had great characters. He had a hand in creating Voyager that had great characters. But he had no hand in Enterprise, which had shit characters. Not a coincidence, I think not. And also the fact that Voyager's characters turned bland and shit after he left. Again, not a coincidence. So yeah, he's all about the characters. And he made TNG all about the characters. So, yeah, I found it a bit ironic that she was complaining it wasn't about the characters, and she left right when they did make it about the characters. But that being said, I'm glad that she did leave, because I think Crusher was so much better in the show, and I really did not care for Pulaski. I know there's a growing part of the fandom which are kind of contrarians who say, no, actually Pulaski was really good. No, she wasn't. She just wasn't. It was just trying to do Dr. McCoy again, and the fact that made her so antagonistic towards Data just was very off-putting. But you know what? part of my complaint about the documentary is that they didn't focus enough on season 2. Like, I wanted more information, particularly because I already heard, maybe that's just because I'm a nerd and I already researched TNG a lot. I've already heard a lot about the creation of the show. So, and again, like talking about the actors and all this stuff, I think it loses focus. I wanted to hear more about the civil war between Maurice Hurley and Tracy Torme, because the part the movie covered was that Gene Roddenberry went on vacation, and Maurice Hurley took over as showrunner temporarily, and Tracy Torme submitted a script which was conspiracy, and Maurice Hurley rejected it, saying that this goes against Roddenberry's vision, his wacky doodle vision of Star Trek, and so he rejected it. But apparently Rick Berman read the script and overrode him and liked it, and so it got made. You know, from information outside of the documentary that I've read elsewhere that it was Gene Roddenberry who liked Conspiracy. Maybe he is after he returned from his vacation, or maybe he, I don't know, saw it somehow, but apparently I heard that he was the one. So, which is kind of ironic because Maurice Hurley was rejecting it on Roddenberry's behalf because he saw it as his job to maintain Roddenberry's vision, even though he didn't agree with it. But then Roddenberry himself was like, oh, no, actually, this is fine. And I can tell you why he thought it was fine. Is because it's not about the Federation or humans or other people, members of the Federation, being evil. It's about just evil aliens taking over members of the Federation and making them do evil things. Because that's Roddenberry's rule, is that there can be no conflict with the perfect human beings or the perfect Federation members. But if you meet aliens outside of it, they're fine to be evil, and that's where you can have conflict. That was his rule. So, and that's why you could have conflict in the show. It had to come from an outside source. And so in this conspiracy episode, even though it seems like it's, you know, an inner turmoil within the Federation, it's actually not. It's coming from an outside source. That's why he hated Star Trek 6 and tried to get it shelved. Like, he didn't want it to get made. But he sadly passed away before it was made. So, but not that he would have been able to stop it anyway. But he hated it because it showed actual members of Starfleet, actual members of the Federation who weren't under alien control, doing a conspiracy to overthrow, and so that he was like, this is unacceptable. But he didn't really have any control of the movies, but he had control over TNG, and I think the documentary did a really good job of exploring Gene Roddenberry and his obsession over TNG, and how during the original series he didn't really have like this vision of a perfect future. Then there was tons of interpersonal conflicts, like Spock and McCoy would bitch at each other all the time, constantly be racist towards each other, and that was fine. But for TNG, they all had to be perfect because his sort of vision sort of evolved like in between shows, and so he wanted to sort of implant this, you know, perfect future, and a lot of writers felt hamstrung, felt handicapped by that. They talked about that in the documentary. But they didn't really cover the part that I covered in my commentary of season 3, that Michael Piller saw that Roddenberry's box, the restrictions, as a challenge. And in fact, Brennan Braga actually did talk about that. He did talk about how he saw that as a challenge that challenged writers to do better, to come up with ideas outside the box. They had to think more about it, which was harder to do in 26 episodes per season. And so from what I gather from this documentary and outside sources outside the documentary, is that Maurice Hurley, was a terrible showrunner, was not up to the task. That's something they mentioned in the documentary, is that when Michael Piller came in and took over, he said that he was just a professional producer, that he's worked on TV shows before, never sci-fi. I talked about this in my Michael Piller video, I think. Never sci-fi, but he's worked on. He was like a seasoned showrunner. Like he knew how shows should run. I think mostly he worked with nonfiction and documentaries, but still, he knows like the inner workings of the writers' room and how shows should work. And he came in and he referred to the way everything was set up was chaos, was chaotic, and so. And that was Maurice Hurley. And also Gene Roddenberry, to be fair. Mainly for season 2 is Maurice Hurley. And so he came in and fixed the well-oiled machine. So he was mainly good from a technical standpoint. He wasn't personable, and that's another thing I talked about in other videos. And they mentioned this in the documentary too, that he wasn't very personable. And that he hired Ira Steven Behr to be sort of his liaison to the rest of the writers' room, because Ira Steven Behr was very personable. But yeah, so, and I talked about this before in other reviews I did for season 2. This is what I noticed last time I went through season 2 with a strong analytical eye and looking specifically at the writing. That Maurice Hurley is a terrible writer. And I think it was it DC Fontana? I think it was. Someone in the documentary gave an interview where they said, well, why is Maurice Hurley in charge? He's never even worked in sci-fi before. He's a cop. He worked in cop shows. And I also talked about how from his style, I got the impression that he was a sitcom writer, because he seemed to favor that sort of cheesy sitcoms 80s style. I didn't look at his biography recently, so I'm not sure if he actually did work on any sitcoms, but they didn't mention Miami Vice, and it's been a while since I've seen that show, but I'm sure that had, if I were to watch it now, would have that same cheesy 80s style to it. So I think he was just used to that. And it seems like he brought that mentality to the show. Now, in some of my specific reviews of episodes, I brought up specific cases of Maurice Hurley making episodes worse. I think the best example of that is Up the Long Ladder, because it was originally, DC Fontana originally had this idea that, sounded interesting about colonists, and she was like, oh, we can do an analogy to Irish settlers, and Maurice Hurley is like, oh yes, let's do Irish settlers, and so they literally got like Irish stereotypes to come in and ruin the show. That was Maurice Hurley. And there's other examples, like there's a few times he came back to do freelance work. And then when that happened, mainly I think it was the episode Galaxy's Child, which is so sitcom-ish and kind of disgusting. And I was like, that's Maurice Hurley, all right. He has that cheesy sitcom feel, which is what shocks me when I learned recently that they hired him to write a script to be considered for Generations, for the first Next Generation film. And like, why in the fuck? Like, Maurice Hurley talked about when he left the show that he was like, thank God, I was so happy, I was smiling to be walking out of there. And I was like, yeah. And they didn't say he gave it the middle finger, but it's practically like what he was saying. He was like, oh, screw this place, I was so happy this place can go rot in hell. Why would they ask that guy to come back? And plus, it just seemed like he was not a good showrunner. I think Tracy Torme in this documentary specifically brought up an event about how there was another writer who was like being very prominent and maybe gunning for the job of showrunner that Maurice Hurley specifically like censured and threw down in the basement and took away most of his privileges because he felt threatened by him. And so Tracy Torme was like, I hate that kind of backstabbing, sleazy Hollywood thing. This is not why I got into the business. Which again, that's just his point of view. I'm sure Maurice Hurley would, not agree with that and sort of debate that and say, oh, that's not actually the case. Or maybe he wouldn't. Maybe he would just admit it. Yeah, sure, I definitely did that. I don't know. The point is, that's just Tracy Torme's point of view. But again, I wanted to know more about this feud between Trace and Torme, because all I heard about is the conspiracy thing, but obviously it went beyond that into season 2, which I've heard tell of, but not any specifics or what. And they're just giving vague generalizations. Now, maybe that could just be people who are being interviewed not wanting to sort of spill the tea or get into it with specifics, so maybe they were just being vague in general to not sort of ruffle anyone's feathers. But that's where I think the documentary could have really fixed. Like if they went into more detail about the turmoil, and particularly in season 2, because they did go into quite a bit in season 1 and talked about how all these writers have been fired constantly, and Roddenberry would go in and change people's scripts, and they weren't used to that. That's, during my research for Roddenberry, that's something he would do all of the time. And he was kind of known for doing that. And I'll be honest, like, and I talked about this before, sometimes I think the changes he makes the episode better. It's just sometimes writers are just against it and saying, oh, that's not kosher. And the whole thing with his lawyer, Malish or whatever, that I mainly learned from this documentary, and that was kind of interesting. I've heard his name mentioned before other places too, but I first learned about him from the documentary, and that was sort of an interesting plot, again, talking about how illegal, really, against union rules he would be, and he would try to do sleazy things because he's not authorized to, actually be a writer. It's like breaking union's rules. He's certainly not supposed to change scripts, but he would go and do it on Roddenberry's behalf. So, one of the things I liked is when they had this thing at the start of the movie where people were talking about Roddenberry, and one person said would contradict something that another person said. And I do love that there was a variety of different views on him. And so people also were a little bit conflicted, had different views on Malish. I don't know if anyone specifically said this, but the conclusion that I drew was that Roddenberry was probably just telling Malish to do the nasty stuff so Roddenberry can maintain a persona, like a sort of facade of being the all wise and nice guy, and so he didn't want to tell someone to their face that the script sucks, so would get his lawyer to do it for him. Although there are examples in the documentary of Roddenberry telling people to their face that they suck. Yeah, so it is clear that when Roddenberry stepped back from the show got better. And as much as I don't like Rick Berman, it is clear that he helped drive, well, at least, again, not the creative side, that was Michael Piller, but the sort of practical side, the money side, the producing side, that he kept things afloat. So he did serve his purpose, and he did, yeah. And again, this is getting into later stuff like Voyager, is that Rick Berman is good for the money, good for the production side, but whenever he tries to stick his nose into the creative side, he's just not qualified to do that. And typically he would let Michael Piller do that until they fired him during Voyager, and that's when the show went to shit, or the franchise went to shit. But that's, again, another story. That's not about this documentary. So that's I guess my overall feelings of the documentary, that I think they should have focused more on the writing aspects and gotten into more specifics and had more focus instead of going off these tangents about actors. Again, it's interesting what they said about actors, but again, if you when you're telling a narrative, you have to focus on that narrative and not have as other bits, even if they might be interesting, they don't serve that narrative, then they shouldn't be there. Because it just makes the... And also, like, Greg Marley talked about the fast-paced tone of it, and yeah, I definitely got that. And I didn't like the music they used in it. They used like this sort of western. I guess they were trying to make an analogy to like a gunfight western or whatever. They go no, like a banjo music. That was distracting to me, and I think that clashed with Star Trek. It didn't really feel like about, that it was about Star Trek, and so I wish they focused. They probably focused more on Star Trek and focused more on the writers and producers. Because here's the thing, like, they interviewed Melinda Snodgrass, but I know from other interviews I've saw outside this documentary with her that she preferred Maurice Hurley over Michael Piller, and she didn't really like Michael Piller, and she didn't get along with him. I wanted to hear more about that. Documentary didn't even touch on that. Was because it mostly portrayed Maurice Hurley as, someone who was chaotic, didn't get along with the other writers. So it would be interesting to hear from someone who did get along with him and actually preferred him to Michael Piller. But they didn't interview her about it. Like, they did mention, like, they did have Ronald D. Moore talk about how some of the writers from season 2 were still there in season 3, and that they were cynical, and they were used to the chaos, and they didn't think that Michael Piller would be any better. But no, yeah, like, give me more. Like, why didn't she like working with Michael Piller? What was it that she thought was better? If other writers are saying he was more chaotic, and the show obviously got better, so obviously Michael Piller was better for the show itself. Yeah, I wouldn't want more details on that. I wanted more details on Tracy Torme. I still don't really know much about him. Yeah, and that's what I'll say. But I will say, when I first saw this documentary, I wasn't really aware of most of this stuff. So most of the stuff I first became, especially the lawyer and shit like that, like the most of the stuff I first became aware of during watching this. So it was a very good, and all the chaos that happened around, behind the scenes in season 1 and 2. I didn't know that. Of course, once you learn about it, I was like, oh, that makes so much sense, because the seasons 1 and 2 are so much worse than the other seasons. That makes sense that there was a result of all this chaos and behind the scenes, and that apparently, I talked about this in my thing for season 3, is that apparently behind the scenes of season 3 was also very chaotic, but mostly that had more to do with the fact that they were so far behind. They were constantly trying to keep up, and there was like everyone talked about it like like laying tracks in the train that was already speeding towards you or something. That was the analogy they made, so they were caught up. But they always talked about how season 4 was like, oh, this is smooth. This is actually what it's like to be smooth and have a smooth operation, and no one's stressed and freaking out and pulling their hair out and yelling at people. And apparently it stayed that way for the rest of the show, although season 7's another story. But that has to do with the fact they were doing DS9, Voyager, and Generations all at the same time, which is dumb of them, and so it was a little bit chaotic in season 7, but basically from season 4 onward, that it was, and they didn't mention that in this film. Like, they should have mentioned that 3, because they talked about how things got better with Michael Piller coming in, but they didn't really touch on the chaos that was still there in season 3, and how Michael Piller would rub the writers the wrong way. Like this story I told in my video that I heard elsewhere about how Michael Piller wrote this memo. I don't think they mentioned that in this movie. I just watched it, unless I fell asleep during that part. I'm pretty sure they didn't mention the memo that he wrote, because they barely touched on season 3. In fact, my memory was like, oh, they didn't touch on season 3 at all, but then I watched it again and I was like, oh, they do touch on it like slightly. But they didn't talk about the memo that Michael Piller wrote to the writers, and R. Stephen Barrett is like, don't send him that memo, don't do it, but he did it anyway. And it was like, this is how you write a scene. It was like very basic fundamental stuff, and all the writers got offended by it, and they were throwing shit around and screaming and calling the agents and, and threatening to quit. Or Ronald D. Moore was like young and just got hired. He's like, I don't see any problem with this. And so things were still chaotic in season 3. But it's funny because, and I talked about this before, is that season 3 I think is better than season 4, even though Michael Piller thinks season 4 is better because it's like, oh, that's when everything was smooth, that's when everyone was getting along. But it's like, it seems to me that better writing actually came from this chaos, which is unlike seasons 1 and 2, because that's what gets to my assumptions about, it makes sense that seasons 1 and 2 were chaotic because they suck. But then season 3 is great, and that was also chaotic, but it was chaotic in a different way. You still had a better showrunner in there who knew what he was doing, unlike first 2 seasons we had Maurice Hurley and Gene Roddenberry. And also Gene Roddenberry was still interfering in scripts in season 3, but season 4 his health was failing, so he wasn't really being involved as much, and of course he passed away during season 5. So you could say season 3 was also a bit more chaotic because of him. But yeah, I don't deify Roddenberry the way some people do, but I will say, when people like Maurice Hurley call and Ira Steven Behr and call his, Roddenberry ideals wackadoodle, I think they're wrong. I 100% agree. Now, I do think Roddenberry was too strict about it, saying, there's no lawyers and everyone gets along and nobody mourns. Like, that's shit like that's dumb. But that humanity will be better, and that the whole moneyless thing is something I totally agree with. You can still have an economy, but not sort of based on greed. And Maurice Hurley, it's funny in the documentary, Maurice Hurley is talking about how, he sees us in present day as a bunch of children just trying to get the most things and being greedy and saying, this is mine. And it feels like the tone that he was saying that implied that he thought that was dumb. I actually agree with him. I think that makes a lot of sense to me. I agree with Roddenberry's vision. And so, yeah, I mean, I do think that Rick Berman and Michael Piller did try to hold his vision for the most part, but I think they weren't as, particularly with the moneyless society and stuff, they weren't as good at doing it. And you could tell, particularly in Deep Space Nine and Voyager, they kind of lose this sometimes and kind of make it feel too contemporary and not really hold in Roddenberry's vision. I don't want to be one of those people because I do like modern Trek, but I do think a lot of modern Trek lose too much sight of Roddenberry's vision, specifically the show Picard, which is my least favorite Star Trek show of any show. That's what I decided recently. But anyway, that's a whole nother topic. That's pretty much all I have to say about this documentary. I'm not going to give it a rating because I don't know. Okay, I'll give it a 7. I'll give it a 7, I guess. But it's interesting. It's hard to say because it's interesting. It's good information. I would recommend it to any Star Trek fan to watch because it gets a lot of interesting take. But I agree with what some of the criticisms that Greg Marley had about it not being put together the best from a narrative storytelling perspective. But yeah, it's definitely got a lot of interesting information. I think it could have done better, but anyway, so that is it for my review of Chaos on the Bridge. If you enjoyed this video, please sure to leave a like, subscribe. You can support me on Patreon if you're a huge fan and you want to see more of my channel. That's a good way to do it and just help support me. Otherwise, yeah, be sure to check out my channel. I'm currently covering Star Trek, every episode of Star Trek, one episode at a time. I am deep into my coverage. I've already finished the original series and Next Generation. Currently working my way through Season 3 of Deep Space Nine, Season 1 of Voyager, because I'm going by air date, and they both aired at the same time. So you can check out my continued coverage of that, and occasionally I'll come here and do other videos like these, particularly when they're requested by my Patreon supporters. Great Patreon supporters, very thankful for your support. And be sure to check out my channel for all that. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you next time.